When Julian first arrived at my doorstep, I didn't know what to expect. He was just a gardener, hired to tend to the overgrown bushes that had been left to run wild around my yard for months. A simple job, something that should have been mundane. But from the moment he stepped out of his truck, I felt something shift in the air. My gaze caught him immediately. Tall, his frame broad and powerful, built like someone who had spent his life working with his hands. His skin was sun-kissed, a healthy bronze that made his muscles ripple beneath the fabric of his faded work shirt. His face was rugged yet striking, sharp jaw, a faint 5 o'clock shadow, and those eyes. Dark, deep-set eyes that seemed to see straight through me, like he could read every secret buried deep in my mind. And then there was the way he moved. Confident. Calm. Like he knew exactly how much space he could take up in the world. And I couldn't look away. The quiet power he exuded, the way his every step seemed deliberate, made my pulse quicken, something I hadn't felt in a long time. His hands were the first thing I noticed. They were rough, calloused from years of hard work. They moved effortlessly over the tools, the skill in his every motion undeniable. But as I watched him, I found my thoughts wandering, imagining those hands on me. His hands weren't just for working with dirt and weeds, they were made to touch, to grasp, to pull me closer. My breath hitched. I couldn't help myself. I couldn't stop thinking about how the tool he held in his hands compared to the one nestled between his legs. I cursed myself for thinking that way, for letting the thought sneak up on me like that. But when he moved with such precision, when he seemed to flow through the work with ease, it was hard to avoid the sensation that there was something much more than just a professional relationship developing. It wasn't just his body that captivated me, it was his presence. There was a quiet intensity in the way he carried himself, something primal that made my instincts buzz with awareness. And the more I tried to push it aside, the more I couldn't ignore the magnetic pull between us. It was as if he was constantly drawing closer, whether it was with his eyes, his movements, or the subtle way he seemed to position himself near me. There was no way it could be a coincidence. He knew what he was doing. He knew the effect he had on me. And I was powerless to stop it. It wasn't long before our paths began to cross more often. Every time he neared, I could feel the heat of his body even before he came into my direct line of sight. And when he finally touched me, just a brush of his arm against mine as he passed me a tool, I felt the shock of it shoot through me. A jolt that seemed to pulse directly from my skin to my very core, igniting something deep inside. "Everything all right, sir?" His voice was low, a gravelly rumble that sent a shiver up my spine, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. I wasn't sure if he was aware of the effect he had on me or if he was enjoying it. I nodded, trying to hold my composure, to remind myself that I was his boss, that this was just a job, just work. But inside, I was unraveling. My body responded to him in ways I hadn't felt in years, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to stop pretending. There was something between us, something undeniable and dangerous, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending that it didn't exist. My heart was beating as I kept my gaze fixed on his, forcing myself to remain steady. But all I could think about was how close he was, how his presence wrapped around me like a fire that I couldn't escape. He was close now, closer than ever before, and I could feel the heat emanating from his body. His scent, a mixture of fresh earth and something distinctly him, enveloped me. Every breath I took seemed to draw him in deeper, and I felt my body reacting against my will. I turned away, clearing my throat, and focused on the task at hand, trying to distract myself from the overwhelming temptation to reach out, to touch him, to see if the heat of his body would match the fire in my veins. But I knew. I knew this was dangerous. He was just a gardener. I was his boss. We were supposed to keep our distance. And yet, every moment that passed felt like we were getting closer to crossing a line that we couldn't uncross. And it terrified me. The moment happened without warning. One late afternoon, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting a golden hue over everything. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and I found myself standing there, caught between the fading warmth of the day and the restless tension growing inside me. I watched Julian work, the effortless fluidity of his movements making my heart beat harder. His shirt clung to his chest with every motion, damp with sweat, outlining the strength of his build as he worked with the tools. His back flexed, muscles rippling beneath the worn fabric, and I felt my breath catch. It was impossible not to notice him. Impossible not to feel drawn to him like the sun pulls the horizon toward it. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his gaze flicking toward me for just a split second. And in that instant, everything changed. His eyes locked with mine, and I saw something in them, something raw, intense, and undeniable. A flicker of something darker, deeper, that sent a shiver straight to my spine. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest as the space between us shrank, closing in with every beat. Julian leaned against the doorframe, eyes dark with something unreadable. He let his gaze linger on me for a moment before speaking, his voice low, almost teasing. "Boss," he began, his lips curling into a knowing smile, "I've noticed the way you've been looking at me lately. It's like you want a taste of me, but it seems you're too scared, or maybe too shy to ask." I froze, caught off guard by his directness. My heart began to race, an unexpected heat rising in my chest. But before I could respond, Julian took a step closer, his presence magnetic, pulling me in without a word. He reached out, his fingers brushing my jaw as he lifted my chin, a spark of mischief in his eyes. Then, without another word, without hesitation, he was there. Right in front of me, his body closing the gap between us with a quiet force that made me pulse with desire. The air between us thickened, heavy with unspoken tension. My breath caught in my throat as his lips hovered mere inches from mine, a challenge in his gaze. Before I could even catch my breath, he leaned in, his lips crashing against mine with a fierce urgency that stole what little breath I had left. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment, just as I had. His kiss was bold, desperate, hungry, like he needed me as much as I needed him. There was no room for thought, no space for doubt. Every nerve in my body seemed to fire at once, my hands instinctively finding their way to his chest, clutching the fabric of his shirt. The kiss deepened, and time seemed to stretch as we both gave in to the undeniable pull between us. I could feel the raw intensity of his desire, his hands tracing the curve of my back, pulling me impossibly closer. His lips left mine, but only to trail along my jaw, my neck, igniting a trail of heat wherever he touched. My head tilted back slightly, eyes fluttering closed as I breathed him in, the scent of him intoxicating. Julian's breath was hot against my skin, sending shivers through my entire body. "I wasn't scared," I whispered, my voice thick with the desire that had been building since the moment we locked eyes. "I was just waiting for you to make the first move." He chuckled darkly, his hands slipping into my hair, tilting my head to capture my lips again, this time with even more urgency. There was no turning back now. His hands, those strong, skilled hands, moved to my waist, pulling me closer, until there was no space left between us. And I didn't hesitate. I kissed him back with equal fire, my body responding to his touch, to the heat radiating off him like a furnace. In that kiss, the world outside the yard ceased to exist. There was nothing but us, just the press of his lips, the warmth of his skin, and the rapid thrum of our hearts racing in sync. The kiss wasn't just a kiss, it was an explosion. Every nerve in my body seemed to light up, every touch from him sending waves of need and desire rushing through me. I lost myself in it, in him. I didn't care that he was my employee. I didn't care that everything about this situation was wrong. All I could think about was how badly I wanted him, how desperately I needed more. That night, I couldn't shake the memory of him. His lips, his hands, the press of his body against mine. It all replayed over and over in my mind, like a fire that wouldn't go out. I tossed and turned in bed, my body restless, aching for something I couldn't define. I needed to see him again. It wasn't a choice. My feet carried me outside, drawn by some magnetic force I couldn't resist. The moonlight bathed everything in a soft glow, the world quiet and still, except for the sound of Julian working in the yard. There he was, his focus completely absorbed in his task, his back to me, his body strong and steady in the shadows. I swallowed hard, my breath catching in my throat as the urge to be near him, to feel him again, became unbearable. Without thinking, my feet moved toward him. My body acted on instinct, driven by a desire I couldn't control. The moment I crossed the yard, the air between us crackled with anticipation. His head turned slowly, and when his eyes met mine, the same dark, smoldering look from earlier flickered across his face. A slight smile tugged at the corner of his lips, and I couldn't stop myself from walking toward him, my heart pounding like a drumbeat in my chest. "Julian," I said, my voice thick with need, thick with something more than just longing. It was desperation, a hunger I hadn't felt in years. He didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. Instead, he took a step toward me, his movements slow but deliberate, his gaze never leaving mine. The moment his hand touched my arm, it felt like the final barrier had been broken. Without another word, he pulled me into him, his body crashing against mine. His lips found mine once more, but this time, the kiss was different. It was slower, more deliberate, charged with a raw intensity that I hadn't expected. His hands slid over my back, pulling me in, until I felt the heat of his body, his muscles pressing against me. There was no room for thought now. There was only him. The kiss deepened, and this time, there was no hesitation, no second thoughts. We were caught in something far bigger than either of us had anticipated. My fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, wanting more, needing more. I could feel the hardness of him against me, could feel the way his body responded to mine. His touch was intoxicating, his kiss an undeniable force that I couldn't escape. And I didn't want to. Each day after that moment with Julian felt like a bittersweet cocktail of torment and pleasure, swirling within me, leaving me drowning in the intoxicating mix. His touch haunted my thoughts, even when he wasn't there. It was as if the memory of his hands on my skin lingered, imprinting itself on my very soul. His scent, the warmth of his body, the press of his lips, they were all still vivid in my mind, replaying over and over until it was all I could think about. I was consumed by it, by him, and the longing in me grew, wild and untamed with each passing second. The yard, our battleground of restraint, had become a battlefield of unsaid words and stolen glances. We didn't speak much anymore. The silence between us was thick with things left unsaid, with a charge that only intensified with every brush of his hand, every fleeting touch. It was as though the air itself crackled when he was near. I tried to ignore it, tried to keep my distance, but every time our eyes met, I saw the same hunger, the same raw need reflected back at me. The tension between us was palpable, and it was becoming harder and harder to fight it. And then, one night, I couldn't take it anymore. The hunger inside me had grown unbearable, a primal need that twisted in my gut and refused to be ignored any longer. I needed him. I needed to feel him again, to taste him, to lose myself in the heat of him. I knew it was reckless. I knew it was dangerous. But I couldn't stop. I found him outside in the corner of the yard, his back to me as he worked, his muscles flexing with each movement, his brow furrowed in concentration. The sight of him, so powerful and effortless in his movements, pushed me over the edge. Without a word, I crossed the yard, my body drawn to him like a magnet. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath shallow as I approached. I didn't hesitate. I pressed myself against him, feeling the warmth of his body, the hard lines of his back beneath my hands. He stiffened for a moment, his body going rigid, but then as if he had been expecting this, he relaxed into me. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound that made my pulse race. His hands reached behind him, gripping me by the hips, pulling me even closer. "You don't have to do this," he whispered, his voice thick with tension, with something darker, something just as desperate as my own hunger. But his hands were already sliding over me, pulling me against him, urging me forward. "I do," I replied, my voice thick with longing, with a need so deep it felt like it was consuming me from the inside. "I need you." I don't know who moved first, who made the decision to cross every line we'd set between us, but suddenly, nothing mattered except the feel of him. The air was thick with desire as our bodies collided, our clothes forgotten, discarded on the ground beneath us. The cool night air was nothing compared to the heat that radiated from us as we pressed closer, closer until there was no space left to be filled. His hands roamed over my skin, rough and insistent, igniting every nerve, every inch of me. Every touch, every kiss set me on fire, burning away all remnants of control I had left. I couldn't get close enough to him. I needed to feel him more, deeper, to lose myself in him. My hands tangled in his hair, pulling him down to me, kissing him harder, deeper, as if this kiss, this moment, could erase everything that had come before it. His lips were smooth, the taste of him intoxicating. But it was the roughness of his hands, the strength in his touch, that had me trembling with need. His body pressed against mine, each movement pushing us closer, as though we were two halves finally coming together. It felt perfect, like we were meant to fit like this, as if the universe had made space for us to exist in this reckless, beautiful moment. We moved together, our bodies a tangle of desire, our hands, mouths, everything colliding in a desperate dance. The hunger that had been building for days, for weeks, finally burst free, and there was no going back. The world outside the yard, the rules, the consequences, they didn't exist anymore. It was just us. Just the press of his body, the fire in his touch, the aching need that thrummed between us. Nothing had ever felt so right, so perfect, so dangerous. I could feel the pounding of his heart against mine, the heat of his body, and the way his hands moved over me like they knew exactly what I needed, exactly how to drive me wild. Every kiss, every touch, every movement was an unspoken promise that nothing would ever be the same again. The boundaries that had once existed between us, between employer and employee, had vanished, replaced by something far more powerful, far more urgent. He took his tool and began to rub me from behind, and the next thing was an intense thrust that made me scream for joy. And I knew in that moment that nothing would ever be able to stop us. Because right now, it was no longer just a physical connection, something deeper had shifted. Julian had marked me in a way I couldn't undo, and now, all I wanted was him. But the question remained, what now? Could we go back to what we had before? Could I continue to keep this secret? I knew I had crossed a line, but I also knew there was no going back. Julian had filled my world, my heart, and my body in ways I never expected. And I wouldn't let go.